Welcome back to the Psychedelic Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, David Flores, CEO of Global Track Solutions. And joining me here today is Stephen Murphy. He is the co-founder of Prohibition Partners. They're hosting the PSYCH Investor Summit next Wednesday, April 21st. And it's being billed as an opportunity to engage with distinguished industry leaders, rising entrepreneurs, and global psychedelic investors to share insights and to help develop this emerging frontier. Stephen, it is a pleasure to have you here with me. We're very excited to be able to feature you in the PSYCH Investor Summit coming up. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks, David. Much appreciated. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you on here. So to just jump into this and get started, why don't you talk to me a little bit about the Investor Summit coming up here on April 21st? I'd love to learn a little bit more about it.
Sure. So the PSYCH Summit is really aimed at bringing European and Asian investors into the psychedelic industry. So giving them a grounding as to what is happening within the industry and how it is evolving globally around the world. And then two, getting them to meet some of the key players and companies who are emerging in this space and driving this industry forward. So we're very fortunate to have quite a wide range of speakers and thought leaders presenting and providing information at the summit, but a collective of investors from Europe and Asia who have been, maybe reading or have their interest piqued a little bit by psychedelics over the last 12 months, but now are ready to engage in the subject and engage in the industry.
Absolutely. And I know that the keynote speaker is Professor David Nutt from Awaken Life Sciences. You also have Ronan Levy from Field Trip Health as a guest speaker, and he's been a friend of the Psychedelic Spotlight podcast for quite some time now. Do you want to share a little bit about some of the insights that some of the guests that you're going to have here on the summit, what they're going to be able to share here with people that attend it?
Yeah. I think for when you look at our investor base and the investor audience who are going to be in attendance, this is very much aimed at how do they place capital within the industry, and certainly how do they understand the value within the supply chain. So there is initial analysis that is going to be provided to them in terms of the market size, market potential, supply chain analysis. But then there's going to be in-depth discussions regarding the value of R&D, IP protection, and the battle around IP at the minute and how it sits. And then, of course, we're going to look at the route to patient and what does that look like? What does route to market actually look like within psychedelics? So it's in essence trying to give them a broader understanding as to the current landscape of the market and the potential. So to understand, how they can distinguish good players from bad players, but I would say distinguish good ideas and good strategies over those that have a backward looking agenda.
Yeah, and we were talking before we started recording here a little bit about your experience in the cannabis space, and I think that's quite fascinating. I think it's important to bring this up because we see some similarities here with the evolvement and evolution here of the psychedelic space that we saw with the cannabis space. And I think there's an opportunity, at least that I've noticed, for us to sort of go back and learn from the mistakes that were made in the cannabis space and to try to not make those again here. Do you want to share a little bit about how relevant that experience, that knowledge that you and maybe anyone has from the cannabis space is in terms of applying it here to the psychedelic space?
Yeah, I think, you're always, in any fast growing industry, you're always going to have conflict and certainly challenges in relation to transparency. So, there is a role of those media groups and those who are, in a place of authority or, in a place to provide knowledge to ensure that there is a filter applied to the industry and to the knowledge that is shared within the space. And I think that is one of the biggest learnings that we have taken from cannabis is it's a little bit different. There's much higher barriers to entry. It is more, it's highly compliant. The levels of, the supply chain is more tightly regulated. There is fewer, the sales process, or certainly the path to revenue, is much longer than the cannabis space. So you're getting different actors involved in psychedelics. So yeah, of course, there's going to be a natural transition of cannabis into psychedelics, but we're actually seeing a lot more from the traditional pharma and life sciences base and biotech who have been dedicated their life to healthcare and health tech, who have been, I suppose, very much at the forefront of innovation at that space, starting to emerge themselves in psychedelics. So it's not, there's always going to be a small proportion of those in cannabis, and certainly cannabis money will follow into to psychedelics. But as part of, the reason why we set up or we're launching the PSYCH Summit Asia and Europe is really we've been approached for kind of within a 3-week period. We were approached by a large number of investors in both Europe and Asia from the life sciences sector and from the pharma sector who had been investing in healthcare, to help them understand the space and help them deploy capital within the space. So the idea for the summit came organically out of a need. But what is different is when we look traditionally amongst North American investors in cannabis, in psychedelics, a lot of the early stage investors have a heritage in cannabis. Whereas when we're telling the story of psychedelics to a European and Asian audience, it's a lot more medical. It's a lot more focused on innovation around healthcare, and less so about the overall industry. And I think that is one of the big learnings that when we've selected the companies who are going to present and who are going to partake at the PSYCH Summit, because we had we only had limited availability, and a number of companies applied to participate, but those who were selected met the criteria in terms of having both a product and a vision that would be attractive to that target audience, and to that to target audience of European and Asian investors.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to see if you can elaborate a little bit more. You mentioned, that component of the healthcare system, and sort of that. I think education is such a big part of everything going on in the psychedelic space right now, because it's so new and so foreign, I think, to a lot of individuals in the investor community. And I think helping them understand sort of, where the potential exists here in this space is so important. And that healthcare element is also very critical to it. And I think it's where things maybe differ a little bit from where the cannabis space and the path that industry went down. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on sort of that healthcare element, and the element in terms of developing solutions designed to really be a complete game changer for mental health?
Yeah, I think, if we just talk of healthcare and our approach to healthcare, in Europe, it's certainly a lot more of a social focus around healthcare, and a better, there's, I suppose, a fair access and better quality around healthcare. And that changes the landscape in terms of how people think in terms of investing in the space, because there is a more accessible market, and it's not driven by short-term profits. There is, it is part of an evolving social healthcare policy that private companies are buying into. So it changes how investments are being made in the space, and certainly the motivations of companies who are operating. So when we talk of psychedelics, this is a long-term development. This isn't something that's going to revolutionize healthcare tomorrow, but in 5 and 10 years time, yeah, of course. But and I think that changes that's very similar to how the European healthcare and health industry, and certainly healthcare investors, deploy capital. So they are very interested by all companies, wherever they are, who are in psychedelics, in terms of how they are developing their innovation within the healthcare industry for the long-term and long-term vision, because they understand, and that is part of, that has been their heritage in relation to investing in the space. If you, I think if the second point around mental health and the impact of mental health, yeah, we really haven't any understanding as to what impact mental health has on society, economic impacts, social impacts, and so forth, where it's called a global epidemic, but in reality the ability to track it and our ability to quantify it is, it hasn't been identified yet. And I think we are really at a very interesting crossroads, where we know that this is something that is off the charts in terms of just how many people are infected, and certainly being compounded by what we're all living through all around the world. Nobody is isolated from mental health. So it is a global, it is truly a global pandemic, but you have suddenly a new form of therapy and a new form of medicine that is proving in early stage results to be much more effective than what is out there on the market. And it's not just effective for short term, but effective for long-term treatment of these conditions. And I think that's, that is, look, it's exciting. It's going to need, this is, you're not talking about a vaccine here that you can give out to 200 million over the course of a year. This is something entirely different. So the way psychedelics is currently applied and the way psychedelics is currently utilized, will need a lot of innovation if it is going to reach the masses who suffer from these conditions. So that's a very, we're a really interesting space where the early stage understanding of what psychedelics can do are proving very favorable. Sorry, but also the understanding in terms of what the route to patient looks like really hasn't been identified yet. Yes, you've got innovations happening in the likes of Field Trip and certainly Awaken, who are providing that path to patient, but you have you're only targeting a small percentage of the addressable market there. And I think for European and Asian investors and global investors looking at healthcare, what's going to shake it up and how it's going to shake it up, that's yet to be discovered. But some of these companies who are partaking at the PSYCH Summit are those who are going to lead the way on that level of innovation.
Yeah, and speaking on that innovation, I mean, the groundwork is already being laid for it. We see companies, you mentioned Field Trip Health. I mean, of course, there's several other companies from MindMed, Compass Pathways. Everything is starting to happen. And as someone that is really immersed like myself, and I would imagine yourself as well, in this space and in this industry, we see everything happen. We see the pieces starting to come together. And I would imagine that a big part of the PSYCH Investor Summit here is to help that segment, sort of the investor community maybe hears a lot going on about the psychedelic space, but doesn't quite understand where the potential exists or where the industry is right now versus where it has the potential to be in 2 or 3 years from now. Last question to you on that would be, where, from your perspective, where do you see the industry here today versus where you believe the potential it has to be in, let's say, 4 years from now?
Yeah, I think, you've got, if you look at how many, if you do even a company tracker in terms of the companies who are active in psychedelics, now there's obviously been an explosion in terms of companies listing and getting access to capital, which is much needed, but the capital that they're getting access to is still relatively small in terms of what it takes from an R&D perspective. And that's going to be, that's going to be the game changer. These companies need billions in terms of innovation for R&D and for clinical trials. And if in 4 and 5 years time we're at billions, and I think that's the next milestone. It's about proving the model and winning the trust in terms of winning the trust and reputation that you're going to be backed by, be it pharma companies, or you're going to be able to attract that type of revenue or that type of investment levels. But that's, that's where we're at. We're at a stage where it's still attracting a plethora of companies, and who are trying to dissect the supply chain and find innovation across the supply chain, and from everything in terms of how to cultivate psilocybin all the way through to patient access and measuring slight incremental benefits and performances in terms of how therapies are conducted. So you have a really, you have this huge gap in the market in terms of epidemic, just mental health, just in terms of one condition, let alone the 50 or 60 that psychedelics can look at. But you have this huge global epidemic that needs a global solution, and so far companies have been limited somewhat to Europe and North America, with a little bit in Oceania, but this is going to need, global solutions. And the beauty about psychedelics is naturally it's been a global community. So, I think I'm very excited about seeing how innovation within psychedelics is going to work and expand globally, and the type of global players we're going to see from companies and innovations in Asia, in Latin America, and so forth.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt there's so much going on in this industry and in this space right now. I mean, it can be information overload, I think, for some people, but that's why I think this Psych Investor Summit coming up on April 21st I think it's going to be a wonderful opportunity to help individuals digest this information, break it down, and really sort of understand what is going on here in the space. And as you mentioned, sort of, the ways that they can get involved from an investment perspective. So I cannot recommend it enough for anybody out there. Stephen, do you want to share if there are folks out there interested in registering for the Psych Investor Summit on April 21st, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, so it's completely free. Just so you know, the whole aim of it is to encourage more debate and discussion, not only in terms of some of the companies presenting, but the information that is being shared by a lot of the speakers around IP, around patient access. So the easiest way to do it is to go to psych.prohibitionpartners.com, and you can sign up for your free tickets there. So it's on the 21st, and obviously, the more the merrier.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure we include that information here along with this podcast for anybody out there interested in registering and signing up for it. But Stephen, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Great pleasure having the opportunity to connect with you and discuss the Psych Investor Summit coming up. I appreciate it.
Perfect. Thanks, David.
Thank you.